The 1950s are often regarded as the golden age of the American automobile. Fueled by a post-war economic boom, cars went from plain and modest to flashy and futuristic, with fins, tri-tone paint, and lots of chrome. And before these space-age-like styling elements found their way to the showroom floor, the buying public was getting warmed up by ever more radical concept cars. The car makers didn't sell you a car, they sold you a dream. Welcome everyone to episode 66 of the Automotive History series, where we're going to take a closer look at the American dream cars of the 1950s. This is going to be a 4-part episode, and this is part 2, the Ford Experimental Car Edition. If rivaling General Motors was the first in releasing a concept car, the Buick Y-Job in 1938, see part 1 of the series, and the Chrysler Corporation quickly followed with the Thunderbolt concept car in 1941, see part 3 of the series, then it's surprising to see that it is awfully quiet over at the Ford Motor Company. At least in my opinion, Ford wasn't all that caught up in the designers' wars of the 1950s. Although Ford certainly had a few stylistic successes, some other cars are a bit bland and look like rolling bricks. Another great example is the Thunderbird, one absolute piece of sexy automotive styling, but even the fins on the rear were very modest compared to the competition. What was going on? You'd think Ford designers had nodded off at the start of the 50s. GM was already stealing the show with the LeSabre and the Buick XP300, and Chrysler was just turning up with the so-called idea cars, designed by Italians. But over at the Ford Motor Company, nothing but crickets.
Hear that? That's the sound of the Ford Motor Company out of business.
However, by 1953, Ford woke up from its styling slumber and released their first concept cars, the Ford X100 and the Lincoln XL500. Although not officially called concept cars, the term wasn't really used yet, they were the self-proclaimed Laboratories on wheels. The cars, loaded with numerous gimmicks, were part of celebrating 50-year anniversary of the company, and so the cars came with the tagline, 50 ideas for 50 years of Ford for the 1950s. Some of the gimmicks included in the Ford X100 were a built-in hydraulic jack system, allowing for easy wheel replacement. It had a sliding canopy roof that reacted to a rain sensor and had radial tires. Inside, the driver was treated on such luxuries like heated seats, in-car telephone, a dictaphone or voice recorder, and the man of the household could shave himself while driving to work so to save some time in the morning. Styling-wise, the Ford X100 and the Lincoln XL500 were certainly futuristic, but not so far out as, let's say, the GM LeSabre, and that's a good thing. With a bit of luck, it could pass off as a regular production car in the coming years, and it was. The general theme and design of the front ends, and mainly the hooded headlights, would find their way on various Lincoln and Mercury models from the mid-50s. And the greenhouse and rear-end styling of the X100 seemed to have influenced the design of the Ford Thunderbird of the early 1960s. After the release of the X100 and the XL500, all bets were off over at Ford. The next year, the company returned and decided to kick it into overdrive. Warp drive. Ford presented for 1954 the FX Atmos. I know, I start to sound like a broken record, but once again, all the quintessentially 1950s atomic age trickery is present on this concept car. There we go again, it looks like a rocket ship on wheels. New this year are the 2 antennas that rip your legs off in case of a pedestrian collision. The 2 cone-shaped taillights that can bash in a toddler's face while backing up. And the car doesn't have a heater, as there will always be scorching hot inside thanks to the all-glass bubble top. This car was nothing more than just a styling exercise, as the car didn't come with an engine or mechanics whatsoever. So literally a car built just to show off. A classic case of a lot of show, but, well, no go. But it wouldn't stop Ford for suggesting that the way it was constructed, it would allow for a nuclear energy powered engine. I mean, why not? I'm not even sure if any of the many styling elements ever found its way to regular production cars, whether it be Ford or others. What is unique, however, is the 3-person seating with the driver placed in the middle, operating the car through hand grips instead of a conventional wheel, and the car was guided by a so-called radar scope. A center screen would provide highway information. So, after lagging behind, now Ford was a step ahead of the competition when it comes to concept car styling, as the far-out space-age styling they had used for the FX Atmos was only getting introduced by the competition in the second part of the 1950s. Ford, Mercury and Lincoln would continue to release and show various concept cars throughout the 50s, but from what I could find only at the major car shows in the USA and Europe, but not at private shows like GM did with their own Motorama shows. But please let me know in the comments if Ford had a similar show. What I do know is that Ford showed some of their concept cars and grand reveals of new regular passenger cars in the Ford Rotunda building, a circular Art Deco building located next to the Ford factory and headquarters in Dearborn. At one point it was the 5th most popular tourist attraction in the USA. Only a fire in the early 60s would put an end to it. By the looks of it, there was some separation in the concept cars that were shown on the shows in the second part of the 1950s. Mercury and Lincoln would mostly show concept cars that weren't really all that far off of regular production cars, and were more or less a vehicular promise of what was coming in the next 2 or 3 years. But Ford, however, would in the meantime present one ever more bizarre concept car after another. Introducing the 1955 Ford La Tosca. The Tosca, although a massive piece of futurism, was more or less something of an industry insider show-off. Much of the design went over the head of the average unsuspecting visitor, but certainly caught the eye of fellow and rivaling car designers. The canted fins and body sculpting was deemed very complex and time-consuming to design and make at the time, and it was, taking the design process 4 times longer than usual. And in that regard, the car was a true styling exercise. Pay special attention to the chrome pieces on the rear end of the car, looking like a rocket ship straight from the cartoons and the comic books. The overall styling of the Tosca would later be adopted by the gargantuan 1958 Lincolns. One interesting detail is that one of the designers created a smaller scaled version that was fitted with a radio-controlled motor, so essentially an RC car that was just starting to get developed in the 1950s. Not only could the car be driven for more than a mile away, many items on the car, like the doors and the headlights, were also radio-controlled. Rumor has it that the designer played a little too much with the car, often scaring the other employees at the studio when it suddenly flew past them down at their feet. For the same year, luxury division Lincoln also presented a concept car with somewhat similar styling themes, the Futura. Just as massive and so low to the ground, giving the car a floating appearance. And for once, to me, it doesn't look like another rocket ship, but more like a... what does it look like? It looks almost like a monster, a beast with a white mouth lurking at you from his deeply recessed eyes. It's like a giant fish from the front and a giant bird from the rear. No afterburner-style bullet-shaped taillights, but lights that follow the natural curves of the unusually shaped outward canting fins. The Futura holds some truth in its name. The styling of the car would influence the Lincolns of the 1956 and 57 model years. The show car was met with favorable reaction, and even made a silver screen appearance. But that's not everything. The car was eventually sold to legendary custom car builder George Barris for the modest sum of $1. And by the mid-60s, Barris found the car an excellent choice to modify it to become the next whip for a superhero. Batman! That's right, the Futura formed the template for the Batmobile. And why not? It didn't require a whole lot of adjustment to integrate the Bat theme in the winged and canted design of the car. By the mid-50s, Ford looked with envy over at GM and their Motorama shows. Some designers within Ford proposed a similar idea, called the Ford Stylorama shows, a combination of GM's Motorama shows and the Parade of Progress carnivals. New and revolutionary concept cars would be shown in matchbox-like trailers pulled by futuristic Ford trucks. And after a bit of careful cost analysis by the Ford number crunching department, the plans for Ford's own private car show were deemed unrealistic. It was then decided that some radical concept cars would be shown as full-size models, and some of them simply as scaled-down versions without any working components. Still, 1958 would prove to be a big year for the Ford Motor Company's styling department, as the Ford division alone released not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 concept cars in one single year. These 5 concept cars range from radical to downright unhinged. Let's have a look at some of them. Let's start with what I regard as the least crazy of them all, the 1958 Ford Galaxy. What we have here is a car with some very pronounced design elements. In the front we find 2 massive gaping tubes that house the so-claimed fog-piercing headlights. Between these openings we find a horizontal grille that also houses the license plate and an extra set of horizontal headlights. The side is typical for cars of the early 1960s, but certainly unique is the absence of a bubble top, replaced by a conventional and I think I like to call it the Landau-style roof with unusually shaped C-pillars. Also note the slightly rearward-leaning rear window, a styling trademark that would be applied to various Mercurys and Lincolns of the later 1950s, better known as the breezeway window. The rear is dominated by 2 massive cutouts, creating some sort of a W shape if you see the car from above. And in the middle of these cutouts are the backup lights, surrounded by massive tail lamps. I dare to say that the designer of this car has to be Elwood Engel, the man responsible for various Thunderbirds and Lincolns within Ford's design department. But what's even more interesting is that as soon after creating the Galaxy concept car, Elwood switched from working for Ford to working for the Chrysler Corporation. There he introduced styling elements he previously used at Ford, especially when you look at the design of the Chrysler Turban car. The Turban car is in many ways a reworked copy of the Galaxy concept car, albeit slightly toned down, but still very much impressive. You can clearly see that the front and rear end styling are carried over from the Galaxy. Of the 4 cars shown in '58, only the Galaxy was created as a full-scale model. The other cars were only presented as scale models. So no real-life sized car with working components, but simply exhibitions, supporting the stories of the future Ford would tell at the shows. The first one of these 3 scale models is the Volante, a model that would show cars were no longer bound to their tarmac surfaces. The sky is the limit. The Volante was going to be the Model T of the skies, thanks to the implementation of 3 huge rotor blades, positioned and controlled in such a way the car would act like a helicopter, another contraption that was just getting popular in the 1950s. As most of you know, flying cars have been promised since the birth of the automobile, and yet things haven't really worked out now, have they? Still, it's interesting to see that the Volante did predict something that would actually be real. With the latest advancements in drone technology, there are quite a few drone car concepts out there that are functional and look very much like the Volante. Next up is a scale model that would show another advancement in a completely different direction: propulsion. Forget cars powered by dinosaur juice, forget cars that run on solar power, forget cars that run on jet fuel, because here is nuclear energy. Ooh. Wait, what? Ah yes, the 1958 Ford Nucleon. Remember, in a time known as the Atomic Age, with new nuclear bombs and the beginning of nuclear power stations, it's radical but not so surprising to see what this new power source could do for cars.
What are the chances of nuclear-powered automobiles or rocket-driven automobiles for the near future?
That's a very difficult question to answer.
Designers envisioned a car where the driver sits before the front axle and right behind him is a little nuclear reactor. The idea is that the driver could choose between different sizes of reactors according whether they valued speed over range or vice versa. The cars would be recharged at charging stations that would essentially replace regular gas stations. And one Nucleon should be able to drive up to 5,000 miles or 8,000 kilometers on one recharge. I can make a lot of comments here about the perceived safety and the effects of a serious rear-end collision of a car like this, but let's just say Ford has some experience with that some 20 years later. The last car I want to talk about is this thing, the Ford XP2000. You know, this is one of those cars that makes you wonder, what the f*** am I looking at? I mean, for real. It's like looking at an image of a car generated by AI. You try to work out what you're looking at, but somehow you can't figure it out. Anyway, the XP2000 was designed as a scale model until sometime later, I don't know the exact year, when a hobbyist decided to actually recreate it as a full-size model. Based on a 1962 Mercury, custom body parts and other bits and pieces were added to create a faithful representation of the model. I like how the car doesn't even have fins, but just straight up rocket boosters dumped on the rear end, and how they sneakily try to get a Chrysler Astrodome dashboard into the center console of the interior. And some magazine called it a restoration of a car that never was. And this concludes our little look into the dream cars made by the Ford Motor Company during the 1950s. Although I did not mention every concept car made, it is interesting to see that Ford had a different approach in bringing the future to the car shows. Sometimes it was quite close to reality, and sometimes so far off. Also interesting is the use of scale models to further support the actual full-size concept cars. By the 1960s, most people had grown tired of the overload of the "hey, look at me" show cars. And most car companies, including Ford, toned it down a bit, not only in terms of styling, but also in the amount of cars shown per year. Ford would kick off the 1960s by introducing some other ideas that went beyond the conventional car, like the two-wheel Gyron, a so-called gyro car. The car uses gyroscopes to naturally balance the two wheels. And then there was this thing, the Ford Levacar Mach 1, something of a gravity-defying personal pod that wouldn't look too bad in an episode of The Jetsons. It sure was form over function, almost a joke really, and as much as it looks like it could fly everywhere, it never took off. Rumor has it that the local fairground operator shown great interest in these machines for his next bumper car ride.